The silence in the Appalachian Mountains wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you heard things that weren't there. Daniel Cross had learned to live with it. 5 years in these woods, 5 years since he'd walked away from everything, and the silence had become his only companion. Well, that and Ghost. Ghost wasn't entirely a wolf, wasn't entirely a dog, something in between, with pale gray fur and eyes that saw too much. Daniel had found him as a pup, abandoned near a rest stop, and somehow they'd recognized something in each other. Two creatures that didn't quite fit anywhere else. The cabin sat in a clearing 3 miles from the nearest dirt road, another 7 from anything resembling civilization. Daniel had chosen it deliberately. The structure was old, built by someone's grandfather decades ago, then forgotten. He'd repaired the roof, reinforced the walls, installed a wood stove. It was enough, more than enough for a man who wanted nothing. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Wake before dawn, split wood, check the traps along the ridge, melt snow for water in winter, draw from the creek in summer, read by lamplight, sleep when exhaustion finally dragged him under. He didn't dream anymore, or if he did, he'd trained himself not to remember. It was late February when everything changed. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of heavy, wet snow that bent the pine branches low and muffled every sound. Daniel was checking his trap line, Ghost ranging ahead through the drifts, when the animal suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward, body rigid. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. Old habits. In 5 years he'd never needed it for anything more than deer, but his body remembered other times, other places where hesitation meant death. Ghost moved forward, not with the excited energy of tracking game, but with something more cautious. Daniel followed, his boots crunching through the snow's crust. They found him 50 yards further, collapsed at the base of an old oak, a dark stain spreading across the white ground beneath him. The man was maybe 40, olive-skinned, wearing civilian hiking gear that was completely inadequate for these mountains in winter, and he'd been shot. The wound was in his side, below the ribs, still bleeding but not arterial. He was conscious, barely, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Daniel knelt beside him, his training taking over before his mind could object. Check the wound. Check for other injuries. Monitor breathing. The man's eyes flickered open, unfocused, and he tried to speak, but only managed a wet cough. Every instinct told Daniel to walk away. Whatever this man had gotten himself into, it wasn't his problem. He'd left that world behind. Left the responsibility of other people's lives in the dust of a dozen foreign countries. He was done carrying bodies, done making decisions about who lived and who died. But Ghost sat down in the snow and looked at him with those knowing eyes, and Daniel heard himself curse. He couldn't leave a man to die in the woods, no matter how much he wanted to be left alone. That line, at least, he hadn't crossed yet. Getting the stranger back to the cabin took nearly an hour. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes trying to help, sometimes dead weight. Daniel half carried, half dragged him, with Ghost scouting ahead to break trail through the deepest drifts. By the time they reached the clearing, Daniel's shoulders burned and sweat had soaked through his thermal layers despite the cold. Inside, Daniel laid the man on his own bed, the only bed, and cut away the bloody jacket and shirt. The wound was a through and through, which was good. No bullet to dig out, but it needed cleaning, needed stitches, needed more medical attention than Daniel could provide with his basic first aid kit. Still, he'd kept men alive with less and worse conditions. He worked methodically, the way the Army had taught him. Clean the wound, pack it with gauze, apply pressure. Start an IV if you have one. He didn't. Keep them warm. Monitor for shock. The stranger's breathing steadied as Daniel worked, and some color returned to his face. It was only when Daniel stepped back, washing the blood from his hands in a basin of melted snow, that he allowed himself to look at the man's face properly. Something about it seemed familiar, though Daniel couldn't place it. Maybe they'd served together somewhere. Maybe he just had one of those faces. The man's eyes opened, clearer now, and fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. Sergeant Cross. Daniel froze. No one had called him that in 5 years. No one out here even knew his name. You've got me confused with someone else, Daniel said, but the lie felt hollow even as he spoke it. The stranger tried to smile, winced instead. Daniel Cross. former Scout Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, Operation Coldwater, Afghanistan, March 2019. He paused, taking a careful breath. You don't remember me, but I remember you. Daniel's hands had started to shake. He clenched them into fists. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. The stranger shifted, trying to sit up, and Daniel moved forward automatically to help him, hating himself for the instinct. My name is Marcus Webb. I was the intelligence analyst embedded with your unit. I was there that night. The room seemed to tilt. Daniel stepped back, his shoulder hitting the wall. Operation Coldwater. He didn't talk about it, didn't think about it if he could help it, but it was always there, lurking in the spaces between thoughts. The mission that had ended everything. That was 6 years ago, Daniel said. Why are you here? How did you find me? Because I've been looking. Marcus's voice was getting stronger now, or maybe just more urgent. And because they're looking for me. The people who did this, he gestured at his wound, they're the same people who set us up that night. Set you up. Daniel wanted to throw him back out into the snow, wanted to unhear those words. But Marcus kept talking, and despite himself, Daniel listened. Over the next hour, as the fire burned low and Ghost lay with his head on his paws watching them both, Marcus told his story. He'd been a contractor, not military, attached to Daniel's unit to provide real-time intelligence analysis during Operation Coldwater. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: infiltrate a compound, gather intelligence on a high-value target, extract without contact. But it had gone wrong from the start. They'd walked into an ambush, coordinated, professional, like the enemy had known exactly where they'd be and when. 6 men died in the first 30 seconds. Daniel had survived only because he'd been on point, slightly ahead of the main group. He'd fought his way out, carried 2 wounded men until one died in his arms, then finally escaped alone into the mountains. The army had called it bad luck, bad intelligence, the fog of war. They'd given Daniel a medal he didn't want, and a medical discharge he didn't fight. He'd spent 6 months in and out of psychiatric evaluations before they finally let him go. It wasn't bad luck, Marcus said now, his eyes locked on Daniel's. It was planned, deliberate. I didn't understand it at first, but I kept the files, kept digging. Took me 3 years to piece it together. Piece what together? Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless. It was the only way he could keep talking. The mission was a setup from the beginning. There was no high-value target. The intelligence was fabricated. Your unit was sent in to be ambushed, to be sacrificed, because someone needed American soldiers killed on that particular night in that particular place. Daniel laughed, a harsh sound without humor. That's insane. Why would anyone? To justify a weapons deal. To create an incident that would shift policy. I don't know all the reasons, and honestly, they don't matter. What matters is that it came from inside. Someone in command sold you out. Sold all of us out. The fire had died to embers. Daniel stood and fed it more wood, methodical, focusing on the simple task, because if he let himself think about what Marcus was saying, he'd either break something or break down. When he finally turned back, his voice was ice. Let's say I believe you. Let's say any of this is true. Why come to me? Why now? Marcus pulled himself up straighter, and Daniel saw the pain it cost him. Because I kept evidence. Files, recordings, communications I shouldn't have had access to. I've been sitting on it for years, trying to figure out what to do with it, who to trust. Then 6 months ago I made contact with a journalist I thought I could trust. Someone must have been watching. They came for me in Denver 2 weeks ago. I've been running ever since. And you led them here. It wasn't a question. I tried to be careful, I thought. Marcus stopped, closed his eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. You're the only other person who was there. The only one who has a right to know the truth. Daniel walked to the window, stared out at the falling snow. Ghost came to stand beside him. I'd pressed his solid warmth against Daniel's leg. The truth. For 5 years he'd been carrying the weight of that night. The guilt of being the one who survived while better men died. The nightmares. The second-guessing. The endless loop of what-ifs. And now this stranger was telling him it had all been orchestrated, that they'd been sacrificed like pieces on a chessboard. Part of him wanted it to be true, wanted to lay down the burden of guilt. But another part, a larger part, knew that this truth was heavier than the lie. Because if Marcus was right, then those men hadn't died for their country or their mission or any of the things soldiers tell themselves to make sense of death. They'd died because someone decided their lives were worth less than whatever political game was being played. "Show me," Daniel said finally. "Show me this evidence." Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small waterproof case. Inside was a thumb drive no bigger than his finger. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. "Everything's on here," Marcus said. "Classified communications, financial transfers, even some audio. Enough to bring down 3 senior officers and maybe a half-dozen Pentagon officials, maybe more. I haven't shown it to anyone since the journalist. I've just been running." Daniel took the drive, turned it over in his hands. In the firelight, it looked almost ordinary. He could take it, plug it into his laptop, the one luxury he'd kept from his old life, and see for himself. Or he could throw it in the fire and send Marcus back out into the snow. He was still deciding when Ghost's head snapped up, a low growl building in his throat. Daniel moved without thinking, grabbing his rifle and killing the lantern in one motion. Marcus struggled to his feet, pain etched across his face. They stood in darkness broken only by the fire's glow, listening. At first, Daniel heard nothing but wind and snow. Then, faint but distinct, the crack of a branch, the whisper of movement through trees. Ghost's growl deepened, his hackles raised. "How many?" Marcus whispered. Daniel was already at the window, using a gap in the curtain to scan the tree line. The snow had stopped, and in the moonlight he could see tracks. Fresh ones, coming from the east. 2 sets. Maybe 3. "They found you," Daniel said. "They found us." The distinction mattered. Daniel wasn't part of this, wasn't involved, could still walk away. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. The moment he'd carried Marcus out of those woods, he'd made a choice. The moment he'd taken that thumb drive, he'd made another. "Can you move?" Daniel asked. "If I have to." "You have to." Daniel was already in motion, military training overriding 5 years of civilian rust. He pulled on his tactical vest, the one he'd kept telling himself he should throw away. Loaded extra magazines, grabbed his knife. Ghost watched him with alert attention, waiting for commands. Daniel moved to the back of the cabin, where he'd installed an exit most people wouldn't notice, a section of wall that pivoted on hidden hinges. He'd built it during his first month here, back when the paranoia was still fresh. Never thought he'd actually use it. "We go out the back," Daniel said. "Move quiet, move fast. There's a ravine about 200 yards north. We get there, we have options. They'll have thermal," Marcus said. "They'll see us the moment we step outside. Let them." Daniel was pulling on his winter gear, helping Marcus into a spare jacket. "Ghost and I know these woods. They don't. We'll have the advantage if we can reach the ravine." He killed the fire, plunging them into complete darkness. Then he opened the hidden door, and they slipped out into the night. The cold hit like a fist. Daniel's breath steamed in the air as he moved. Ghost at his side, Marcus following as best he could. The snow was deep, but Daniel knew the path, knew where the ground was solid and where it would give way. Behind them he heard a shout, then the sharp crack of a rifle shot. They ran. Marcus was struggling, his breath coming in pained gasps, but he kept moving. Daniel could hear their pursuers crashing through the brush, not bothering with stealth now. More shots, but wild, firing at shadows. The ravine opened up ahead, a deep cut in the landscape where a seasonal creek had carved through rock over centuries. Daniel slid down the near side, catching Marcus when he followed. They pressed against the frozen earth, listening. 2 men appeared at the ravine's edge, silhouetted against the sky. Professional, from the way they moved. Military or ex-military. They had rifles with mounted lights, scanning the darkness below. Ghost was a shadow beside Daniel, utterly still. Daniel had his rifle up, sight picture perfect, safety off. He could take them both before they even knew what hit them. 5 years ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. But he wasn't that person anymore, or he'd been trying not to be. These men were following orders, same as he once had. They probably didn't even know the full story, just that someone wanted Marcus Webb dead and was paying well for it. Daniel waited, finger on the trigger, watching. The men conferred in low voices, then moved along the ravine's edge, searching for a way down. When they were out of sight, Daniel touched Marcus's shoulder and they moved, following the ravine bed deeper into the wilderness. They walked for hours. Marcus's pace slowed as his adrenaline faded and pain took over, but he didn't complain. Ghost ranged ahead, alert for danger. Daniel's mind was racing, trying to process everything, trying to make a plan. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, They'd reached an old hunting shelter Daniel had discovered his first year in the mountains. It was barely more than a lean-to, but it had a roof and was invisible unless you knew where to look. They collapsed inside, Marcus's face gray with pain and exhaustion. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here long. Those men would keep searching, would call in more help, and eventually they'd find them. The mountains were big, but not infinite. He pulled out the thumb drive, looked at it again in the growing light. "What do you want from me?" he asked Marcus. "Really? Why come all this way, risk everything to tell me this?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. "Because you deserve to know. Because those men who died deserve to have someone know why. And because—" He paused, met Daniel's eyes. "Because I've been carrying this alone for too long. It's too heavy. I thought maybe, if you knew, if we both knew, maybe we could figure out what to do with it." "There's nothing to figure out," Daniel said. "You take this to the authorities, the press, whoever will listen. You expose it. That's what you do with the truth. Is it?" Marcus leaned back against the shelter's wall. "Think about it, Cross. The people implicated in these files, they're not low-level bureaucrats. They're generals, department heads, people with power and connections. You think they'll just roll over? They'll fight back. They'll destroy us, discredit us, make it all disappear. And even if we somehow win, even if the story comes out, what then? Will it bring those men back? Will it change anything?" Daniel wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because Marcus was right. The machine that had chewed them up and spit them out was too big, too entrenched. Exposing it might make him feel better, might give him a sense of justice, but it wouldn't undo what had been done. "So what?" Daniel said. "We just let them get away with it? Pretend it never happened?" "I don't know." Marcus closed his eyes. "I've spent 3 years thinking about this, and I still don't know." Ghost suddenly lifted his head, staring back the way they'd come. Daniel heard it too. Movement in the forest. Voices calling to each other. They'd been found faster than he'd expected. Daniel made a decision. It wasn't the decision he'd expected to make when he woke up yesterday morning in his quiet cabin, and it probably wasn't the right decision, but it was the only one he could live with. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to get off this mountain. We're going to get you somewhere safe. And then we're going to make copies of everything on that drive and send them everywhere. Media, Congress, the Inspector General, everyone we can think of. Maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe they bury it. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll know we didn't just let it go." Marcus opened his eyes, studied Daniel's face. "That means going back into the world. You sure you want that?" Daniel looked at Ghost, at the forest around them, at the simple life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. It had been peaceful, or close enough, safe, isolated, and utterly empty of meaning. "No," he said honestly. "I'm not sure at all. But I'm even less sure about doing nothing." They moved again, Daniel taking point with Ghost, Marcus following as best he could. The voices behind them grew louder, closer. Daniel knew these woods, but wounded and slowed by Marcus, they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. At midday, they reached a decision point, a fork where one path led deeper into the wilderness and the other wound eventually toward civilization. Daniel stopped, considering. They could try to lose themselves in the mountains, buy time, but Marcus needed medical attention soon. Or they could make for the highway, take their chances on the open road. "How far to the nearest town?" Marcus asked. 7 miles, maybe 8. Daniel checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged fight. "Can you reach it before they reach us?" Daniel looked at Ghost, who stared back with those pale, knowing eyes. Could they? Maybe. If Marcus could keep the pace. If they got lucky. "Yeah," Daniel said. "We can make it." They ran. Not the panicked flight of last night, but a steady, ground-eating pace that Daniel's ranger training had burned into his muscles. Marcus kept up, driven by desperation and adrenaline. Ghost ranged ahead, finding the easiest path through the snow and deadfall. Behind them, the voices faded, then returned. Faded, then returned, like a tide they couldn't quite escape. Daniel heard the crack of branches, the curse of someone who'd slipped on ice. Their pursuers were flagging too, unused to the terrain, unused to the altitude. The sun was setting when they finally stumbled onto the highway. It was a rural 2-lane road, mostly empty, but it was civilization. Daniel flagged down the first vehicle he saw, A pickup truck driven by an older man who took one look at Marcus's condition and didn't ask questions, just told them to get in. At the small town's medical clinic, Daniel stood outside while a doctor worked on Marcus. Ghost sat beside him, and together they watched the road, watched for vehicles that didn't belong, watched for the men who would keep coming. Marcus emerged an hour later, pale but steady, his wound properly cleaned and bandaged. The doctor had wanted him to go to a hospital, but Marcus had refused. Now he stood next to Daniel, both of them looking at the mountains they'd just escaped. "What now?" Marcus asked. Daniel pulled out the thumb drive. In the streetlight's glow, it looked impossibly small. All that death, all that betrayal, contained in a piece of plastic smaller than his thumb. "Now we fight back," Daniel said. "We find a place with internet. We make copies. We start sending them out. We tell the story, and then—" He paused, really thinking about it for the first time. "And then we deal with whatever comes next." Marcus nodded slowly. "They'll come after us. You know that, right? Even if the story breaks, even if some of them go down, there will be consequences." "I know." Daniel looked at Ghost, then back at the mountains. "I've been hiding for 5 years. I'm tired of it. Those men who died, Brady, Kowalski, Chen, the others, they deserve better than silence. They deserve the truth, even if it's ugly. Even if it costs us." They walked into the town, found a small motel with Wi-Fi. Marcus set up his laptop while Daniel stood guard. As files began to upload, as emails began to send, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not peace exactly, not relief, but something like purpose, like meaning, like the knowledge that he was finally doing something instead of just existing. Ghost lay by the door, ever watchful. Outside, cars passed on the highway, people going about their normal lives, unaware that in this small room, a story was being set free that might change everything or might change nothing. Daniel thought about the cabin in the woods, about the silence and the solitude. Part of him would always miss it, always long for that simplicity. But he'd been wrong to think he could hide from the past. Wrong to think that isolation was the same as peace. The truth was heavy. Marcus had been right about that. But carrying it together, carrying it into the light, somehow made it bearable. "It's done," Marcus said, closing the laptop. "Sent to 15 different news organizations, 3 congressional committees, and the Inspector General's office. If nothing else, it's out there now. Someone will have to look at it." Daniel nodded. He didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if they'd be believed, if anyone would care, if justice was even possible for something that happened 6 years ago in a war most people had already forgotten. But he knew this. He'd made a choice. Not to hide anymore. Not to carry the weight alone. Not to let the truth die in silence. Ghost stood and pressed against his leg, and Daniel rested his hand on the animal's head. Whatever came next, they'd face it, together. No more running, no more silence. Just the long, uncertain road ahead, and the truth walking beside them.